Good morning. That wasn't very enthusiastic. Let's try that again. Good morning. My name is Mason Cushing. I'm in the 12th grade, and I'm so excited to share my story with you today. My story is similar to many of yours. I was saved at the age of 7. Around this time, we found our church in Minnesota, and I grew up surrounded by Christian values, Christian teachings, and Christian people. Over time, I learned the basics of Christian doctrine, and after moving into the youth group at our church, I developed a greater hunger for the teaching of God's Word. As I got older, I began delving into topics such as Revelation and even Biblical Greek. Not many other teenagers like to learn Biblical Greek, but I genuinely enjoyed what learning I got from it. Eventually, I began to feel like I was not growing enough in my faith. Although I was still studying the Bible and learning Biblical Greek with my pastor, I knew that God had more for me, and I began praying and searching for what He had for me next. Sometimes you have to be careful what you pray for. God just might give you an answer you don't expect. Around this time, one of the pastors at my church in Minnesota was asked to resign. Many of the members of the church were very upset, and church attendance and membership dropped. I distinctly remember standing in the doorway when the adult church members were arguing about what had happened. I watched someone come out of the room and say, "I'm never coming to this church again." This was sad for me to hear, as I had never seen infighting in a church before. Some months later, our current youth pastor expressed interest in moving on to fill some of the roles of the pastor who had resigned. The search for a new youth pastor began. Over the course of about 6 months, we had at least 4 different candidates come and go. It was a slow and painful process. After all this searching, we finally found a youth pastor candidate that seriously considered staying with our church. And for several months, it looked like our student ministry and our church could finally regain some normalcy. He was offered the job, and we were all hoping he would accept soon. I didn't realize it at the time, but Saturday, June 8th, 2019, became a defining moment in my faith. I received 2 important pieces of news on that day. One was that our youth pastor candidate would not be taking the job. He decided that God was calling him back to Bible college to complete his pastor's degree. The second piece of news was that Dad's company was shutting down its facility in Minnesota and wanted us to move to Colorado. However, our parents weren't sure that Colorado was where God wanted us, and for a long time, it was uncertain where we were going to move. Not only did we have to ready ourselves for the move, we also had to deal with the uncertainty of not knowing where we were moving and where Dad would be working, and that was not easy. During the prayerful months that followed, my family and I had to learn to trust God with whatever He has planned for us. Although it was hard at the time, looking back, I can see that God was working to grow me in my faith. I realized then that God was answering my prayer, just not in the way I expected Him to. We knew we would be leaving Minnesota, we just didn't know where we were going next. This part of my story reminds me of the story of Abraham. Abram was an elderly man living in the Old Testament, living in the city of Ur with his family in the Old Testament. We don't know much about Abram's history before his story begins in Genesis 12, verse 1, which says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you.'" Just like He did for our family, God was calling Abram away from everything he had known to a place Abram didn't know. The Bible doesn't say how Abram felt about moving, but it's not hard to imagine. He probably didn't enjoy it, but Abram still went. Just as Abram would have missed out on God's blessings for his life if he had refused to go, so we knew that we needed to prayerfully search out what God wanted us to do in order to receive the blessings that God had for us. Eventually, our parents decided that God was calling us to Austin, Texas, and we began researching the opportunities that awaited us there and making concrete plans for when and how we would move. Although it was hard, we knew that God was leading us elsewhere, and God helped us find a peace in that. We said our goodbyes to our home, our church family, and all hope of ever seeing snow again. Or so I thought. Just like the weather, not everything went as we thought it would. We moved to Texas in September of 2019, and after moving to our current home, we began searching for a church family, new friends, and a sense of normalcy that we had lacked over the months of our move. I began attending in-person dual credit classes at Austin Community College and looking into college applications for when I graduate high school. We began searching for a new church, and I started looking up everything each pastor was saying and thinking about it for myself. On spring break of 2020, COVID hit, and I have never returned to in-person school to this day. My fragile, newly obtained sense of normalcy was shattered, and our search for a new church became that much harder. During lockdown, it was impossible for me to meet new people and begin moving on after our move, and that was frustrating, to say the least. Because of this, we began watching online sermons from our church in Minnesota, and although we missed our old church, it had changed a lot. And in September, the senior pastor finally retired. After his retirement, we began watching online sermons of churches in Austin, but most of them became an exercise in discernment as I compared each point the pastor made to the teachings of the Bible. It was difficult to find a church whose doctrines we agreed with and which we were comfortable calling our church home. Abraham likely felt the same way about finding his new home. In Hebrews 11, verse 8, it reads, "By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going." Abraham didn't know where God was leading him, but the important part is that he went, believing that God would provide what he had promised. As a result, God provided the blessings he promised in Genesis 12, verse 2, which says, "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Our family moved forward with what God had for us, not knowing where he might lead us next, but trusting him that he would provide for our spiritual needs. In doing so, we learned that God provides blessings when we walk in faith, just like Abraham did. Our search for a church home ended when we found Austin Baptist Church, and since we joined about 6 months ago, I've had the opportunity to meet new people, grow in my faith, and serve in the church. We were happy to find a church with biblical doctrines and a thriving student ministry. Throughout all this time, God was molding me, and when I look back on what he has done for me, I can see that he answered my prayer for greater growth in my faith. We may not always see what God has for us, but it is always what is best for us and for his glory. And throughout all this, God was helping me to become more like Jesus. I can't wait to see where he takes me next. Thank you.
Good morning. Alrighty. My name is Ashton Rausch, and I am a senior at Hyde Park High School. As long as I can remember, my family and I have been coming to church at 10:10 every Sunday since ABC opened. I was baptized here at ABC at the age of 9, and I've made all of my best friends through this church. I attended church camps, youth groups, and mission trips. And at that point, life was good, and I was on the right track. The summer before my freshman year of high school, my family was uprooted from Austin to Atlanta, Georgia. I didn't know it at the time, but I was about to face one of the biggest challenges in my life, in a new place, at a new school, with brand new people. It was really hard. I went through the first couple months of high school without much of a social network, and I was scared of having to start over. Throughout the rest of my freshman and sophomore years, I struggled to make relationships. I watched my friends in Austin grow up from 1,000 miles away. Meanwhile, I felt that I was stuck at a standstill. By the end of my sophomore year, one of my new friends in Atlanta told me that she was struggling at home. Over that summer, I convinced my parents to let her move in with us, and by the beginning of my junior year, she lived down the hall and we were enrolled at the same school. At the time, I thought this was the best idea ever. I figured my family would help her get her on her feet and ready for college. Once she moved in, we found out that she struggled with a nicotine addiction and severe mental health issues. Over time, she became very cynical and closed-minded. I'd always been a leader, so I figured that her mindset wouldn't affect me very much, but sadly, I started to become who I surrounded myself with. I became very closed-minded and critical of everything around me. It even impacted my social life. I stopped going to school dances or football games because I was too cool for that now. I began to despise going to church because I felt that I didn't fit in. Instead of seeing the girls at my church as sisters in Christ, I saw them as people who would judge me for who I was becoming. To make it even harder, during this time, I had 2 friends attempt to take their lives. This made me question everything. I started to struggle with my own anxiety and my own sadness. I had lost touch with all of my old friends, and I felt out of touch with the friends I had right in front of me. I felt completely alone. It makes me think of a guy in the Bible named Joseph. Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob. In Joseph's story, everything also started off great. He could interpret dreams, and he was definitely his father's favorite son. His dad gave him a coat of many colors, and because of that, his brothers envied him. And so Joseph as well was completely alone. In Genesis 37, we read, "They said to one another, 'Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams.' But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, 'Let us not take his life.' And Reuben said to them, 'Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father.' So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it." How alone must have Joseph felt in that moment? He had just been thrown into a pit by his own brothers, with nothing to face other than his own thoughts. I always wonder if Joseph thought, if I lived a life fulfilling to God, why would he allow this to happen to me? In Atlanta, I felt that I was in my own pit. When COVID came about, my family decided that we were going to move back to Austin. When I heard that, I was very optimistic. I felt as if this end to my sadness was so close. I was going to be moving back to Austin with all of my old friends, and everything was going to be fixed. The girl that was living with us was going to be going off to college, and I was going to be able to have a fresh start. So we packed up and we moved. And for a short while there, I felt free. Until one day, we stopped hearing from that friend. We eventually got in touch with her mom and found out that she had been admitted to a mental hospital for a suicide attempt. We rushed her to Texas and tried everything to get her help. We tried everything. For some reason, I thought that if I prayed hard enough, I could fix her. I prayed every day, and I felt that God wasn't listening. I prayed harder and harder, and she got worse. I felt selfish to start feeling bad for myself. I began to resent God for putting me back in this situation. She became very manipulative and harmful, and as she became worse, I became worse. The sense of loneliness I had during this time was heavy. This type of loneliness wasn't fixed with people. I tried surrounding myself with people, I tried isolating myself, and nothing worked. At this point, I was at my lowest. Every time I went to church, I knew that God was my only way out, but I allowed my pride to keep me from him. So my friend got worse, I got worse, and the cycle continued. It all led up to one night where life felt impossible. I had looked back on the last few years of my life, and I was crushed. I was once a straight-A student who had become below average. I once looked forward to Sundays, which now I resented. I felt like a failure. I wonder if Joseph was as frustrated as I was during this time. He just seemed to go from one pit to the next. Joseph's brothers ended up selling him into slavery in Egypt, and after being enslaved, he was accused of a crime that he did not commit, and he was sentenced to prison. Joseph went from the pit to prison, from rough season to rough season, and I could resonate with him. It felt like I was trapped in my own vicious cycle, but my perspective was changed by one defining moment. As the night went on, it felt that my path got wider and wider, and I got smaller and smaller. I didn't want to continue on anymore. When I felt that I was at the end of my road, I heard my phone vibrate. 2 of my friends from church had reached out, one of which was my lifelong best friend, Izzy, as many of you know, and one of which being a friend that I hadn't talked to in months. It felt like God was reaching his hand out to me. In that moment, I felt comforted. The sense of loneliness I once had faded, and my view that was once clouded became clear. I promised to no longer carry my burdens alone, and I knew that God could help me lessen the weight that I had been carrying. I began to open up again, and God led that friend that was once in my life on her own path. He led all of my old friends back to me and even allowed me a second chance at a new school. I want to emphasize the power of remembering and reaching out to someone. Is there someone in your life that God is putting on your heart to reach out to today? Joseph was rescued from prison in the same way. While in prison, Joseph encountered Pharaoh's cupbearer and was able to correctly interpret a dream for him, and he asked the cupbearer to remember him when he was restored. After a time, Pharaoh had a dream and he did not understand. And we were told in Genesis 41:9, "Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, 'Today I remember my faults.'" Then he goes on to tell Pharaoh about Joseph, and Pharaoh invited him out of his prison cell. God blessed Joseph with the interpretation, and through it, Joseph was restored. He was made the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, and through him, the Israelites were saved. And it all happened just because the cupbearer didn't forget about Joseph during his suffering. Back to my story, everything in my life has changed since that text message. I am now a straight-A student again, trying my hardest to get back to where I know I should be, and I no longer allow myself to be surrounded by people who do not care for me. I allow myself to be in the world, but not of the world, and I now surrender my pain and doubt, knowing that God is with me. I play on Sundays in the 1111 band, and I am doing my testimony in front of you today. I'm thankful for the life that God has allowed me to live. I no longer resent what I went through in the past, and I'm thankful for the growth that I made during that time. I would not be the person I am today without the person I was. Without the trials that Joseph faced, the people of Israel would not have been saved. God used the hardships in my life to bring me closer to him. Without the pit that I was in, my faith would not be where it stands today, and I am excited to see where God takes me next.
Man, what a powerful, powerful day this is. Student Weekend is always one of my favorite weekends because it takes a lot of courage for students to stand up on a stage like this and share their stories. So thank you to both of you for that. When Jonathan and I originally met about bringing a Student Weekend to Austin Baptist Church, one of the things that we discussed was, what is the theme going to be? Because we want students to come up and want them to share their stories, but we also want to have them focus on a particular part. And so for this year, our theme was defining moment. And so today you heard that from Mason. You heard about that day in June whenever he got the two important pieces of news for Ashton when she's at her absolute lowest and she receives those text messages. And today I want to share with you a defining moment in my life that actually led me here to Austin Baptist Church. So in the spring of 2019, my wife graduated from vet school at Texas A&M. Give 'em a whoop. Thank you. I'm sorry for all UT fans. It just felt necessary. So she graduated from the greatest university in the world, and then we moved to Houston. No? Okay, sorry. And then we moved to Houston, Texas. And we were very excited to move back. My wife got her dream job. She was going to be working at the clinic that her family had always taken their pets to, working for her mentor, and even with a path to own the clinic in 3 to 5 years. And I likewise got a job working at a church out in the Katy area as a student pastor, and we were just pumped. We were excited to be back with old friends, with her family, and to finally get started in life whenever she was not in school. And it was great for a while, but as the year progressed, some incidents started to happen at the church. Nothing bad, just small interactions where I kind of realized this church is not where I'm going to be long term. That it's just not a good fit for me. Now, it's a great church with great people. It just wasn't the right fit for me personally. And then the year progresses, and we get into December, and a tragic thing happened. Ellie's boss and mentor actually passed away from a heart attack unexpectedly. And so when this happened, everything changed for Ellie, where she had this dream job, but now suddenly more responsibility has been put on her. She's lost that safety net and her mentor, and the culture began to change. And this place that she loved was now suddenly a place that she dreaded going to. And as we entered into 2020, I'm going to be honest with y'all, I was in a really rough spot as a pastor. I've been working in full-time ministry since the fall of 2012, and here I was at the beginning of 2020, and I was burned out. I no longer enjoyed working at a church. I had lost that passion. I had lost that excitement, and I just felt like I had lost that calling that I had. And so as the year progressed, I actually started to daydream about what I could do outside of ministry. I had committed to 2 years at the church. I was like, I'm going to serve my 2 years, and then I'm going to go on and I'll find something else. I began to think, what can I possibly do? And so I was like, maybe I could get my alternative teaching certificate and become a teacher. Or maybe I get my real estate license. Or on my darkest day, maybe my brother-in-law is high up in an insurance company. Maybe I can get a job as an insurance claims adjuster, right? Like, this is what I'm dreaming about. So just really anything different than what I was currently experiencing. And obviously, I'm here today, so we didn't go that route. And it's a good thing, because I'm going to be honest with y'all. It took me the better part of a decade to graduate with a degree in leadership. And despite what you might think, stage presence, sassy VBS cheers, and the ability to lead group games are not the most marketable skills out there. So if I left the church, I don't know what I was going to do, all right? I really don't. And so luckily that didn't happen. So we continue on from this, but even though Ellie and I are both unhappy with where we're at that time, we were still clinging to this plan that she was going to buy this clinic. And so like we're going to be in Houston for forever. And so we went out and we bought a house. And it was a great house, and we loved it, had good neighbors, and all that kind of stuff, but neither one of us was happy in our jobs. And then I got a text, actually just about a month after we bought this house, I get a text from Jonathan Spencer. And it's on Father's Day, and I'm at lunch with Ellie's family, and her dad's there. And the text says, "Hey, Nathan, I got the opportunity, not official yet, but I have the opportunity to go to a church called Austin Baptist Church and be the lead pastor there. And I've got a couple of positions I need to fill. I need a student pastor. I need someone to work in tech. Do you know of anybody who would be interested?" And I didn't even consider it. I was like, we just bought a house, hard pass. And then someone at the table even made the joke, well, if only he had texted you a month ago before you bought the house, you could have taken this job. And I was like, yeah, that would have been great, but it is what it is. So then a little bit later, Jonathan and I go to get a meal, not as a job interview, but just so that I can say congratulations on your new job, and then just kind of see how things are going for him in that time. And little did I know at the time, but that lunch was going to become a defining moment in my life, to where we go to lunch and we start talking and catching up, and we're talking about life, and then all of a sudden I'm like, Jonathan, hey, tell me about this church that you're going to go work at. And so Jonathan begins to describe his journey to Austin Baptist Church and how it kind of all came about. And then he starts to talk about this amazing church, how it was founded and how it was started and where the location was and the building and how beautiful it was and how great the people were and this culture that existed inside the church of volunteering. And this weird thing started to happen. As he began to talk about this, I started to get really excited. Like, I wasn't even applying for the job. I wasn't going to Austin Baptist, but I was getting really passionate and fired up. Like, oh my gosh, great building, that sounds fantastic. Oh, the people are cool, great, let's do this. Like, I'm getting really excited. And even stranger than that, I started to actually think during that lunch of what I would do if I was the student pastor at Austin Baptist Church. And I began to dream and think about, okay, well, here's all the things that we could do. Here's what I would want the ministry to be known for. And began dreaming about all of these things. But the whole time, like, keep in mind, not even planning on taking the job. But during that lunch, my passion and my excitement for ministry came back. And I felt my call just be restored and be renewed. And we got to the end of the lunch, and I think Jonathan could sense this, because then he asked me at the end, he was like, Nathan, do you want to be considered? Do you want to apply? And I was like, yes, but no, I don't want to move to Austin. Like, what about my house? What about our plan to buy the clinic? What about all of these things? Like, how could we make this work? But I was like, you know what? Let me pray about it, and I'll get back to you. And so I remember I was on the way home, and I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, okay, be cool. I don't even know if I want this yet. Don't bring it up with Ellie yet. Like, we'll talk about it in person tonight once you figure it out. But I called Ellie on the way home, and she was like, how was the lunch? Tell me about it. So I started talking about it, and we get to the end of the conversation, and she was like, you want the job, don't you? And I was like, kind of. And so we went home, and we prayed, and we talked about it, and we had our fears, and we had our doubts, but obviously, as you can see with me being up here today, it worked out, and we followed in this. But I can't help but think about my original response to Jonathan's question. Do you want to enter your name in consideration for the job? And my immediate response was no. My immediate response was no, but not because I didn't feel like God wanted me there, but because we just bought a house. We had a plan, right? Like, this doesn't really fit. Like, yeah, it sounds great, but it doesn't fit with our plans. And it's crazy of me to think about that now, because I can sit here and just think about the fact that as burned out as I was, as much as I had prayed for God to give me an answer and show me where he wanted me to be, and he finally does, and my first response is, what about my house? What about Ellie's plan? What about Ellie's job? What about her family being here? And it makes me think about Peter. So if you were here during Easter, you heard Jonathan talk about the restoration of Peter. So Peter denied Christ 3 times, and then Christ dies on the cross, and then he is raised from the dead. And then a little bit later on, you see that some of the disciples are going back in their fishing, and Jesus reveals himself in his resurrected body on the beach, and they sit down and they have a meal with him. And then, of course, Jesus asks Peter 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I do. And I think it's a great story, but if you continue on in the verses, I think that something that a lot of us do comes out. So we're going to be in John 21, starting in verse 18. Truly I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hand and someone else will tie you and carry you where you do not want to go. He said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. After saying this, he told him, "Follow me." And then in verse 20 it says, so Peter turned around and saw the disciple Jesus loved following them, the one who had leaned back against Jesus at supper, and asked, "Lord, who is the one who's going to betray you?" And when Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" I want you to think about what just happened. Peter denies Christ. Peter watches Christ get crucified. And now Peter just got finished having a fish sandwich with Jesus on the beach in his resurrected body. And Jesus lays out for him, here's what's going to happen in your future. And do you notice what Peter's first response is? What about John? Like, how crazy is that? It's like, Peter, you're blowing it. Like, you are missing it, man. Like, you have an opportunity to sit down with Jesus, and he's telling you what you're going to do, and you're worried about John? And how many of us, though, do this exact same thing? I know I did it. Or I'm at that lunch, and I'm excited, I'm reinvigorated, I'm renewed, I'm ready to go, I'm fired up. But what about my house? What about our plans? What about our finances? What about all of these reasons why it doesn't make any sense for us to pick up and move to Austin, Texas? And so many of us, I truly believe this. It's not that we don't know where God wants, what he wants us to do. It's that we don't like the cost. It's that we're more worried about what's happening and what it would cost us and what it would take to actually do that than we are about what God has called us to do. And then in verse 22, we see this beautiful response. And it's so simple, but I think it's so poignant. This is Jesus responding to Peter. He says, "If I want him to remain until I come," Jesus answered, "what is that to you? As for you, you follow me." Jesus' response is very simple. Peter, why are you worried about John? You follow me. What happens to John doesn't matter. I've called you to follow me, so just do that. In the same way, I think that reminder is so good for us today, because sometimes what happens is we find out what God wants and we're like, I don't know if I have the right words, or what about my plan? What about my comfort? What about this? What about that? And Jesus is just saying, hey, don't worry about that. You follow me, right? You follow me and I'll take care of the rest. And there's a really amazing truth that if we end up following after what Jesus has for us and what God has for us, he makes a way and he provides blessings whenever we are faithful in what he has called us to do. So with Ellie and I, we now have this home that at this point is 2 months old. And we talked to our realtor and I'm like, well, we need to sell it. And she was like, terrible idea. If you sell it, not only will you lose all the money you just put into it at closing, but also you're going to have to bring more money to be able to sell it. And that's assuming we sell it at a profit after 2 months, which is not likely. So like, okay, cool, plan B. We're going to rent it. I don't want to be a landlord. I don't want to have people living in my home, but it's our really only option. So then this anxiety begins to come on. Well, what are we going to do? Because we don't know how long it's going to take to find somebody to rent it. How long are we going to be paying mortgage payment and rent? And so we're worried about all of these things. We listed it on a Tuesday, and by Friday we had a signed, executed lease. And then I'm worried about the finances of the move, because any of y'all who have moved before, especially to a different city, it's an expensive process. At the time, we don't have anybody to live in our home, so I'm worried about that. So we're going to be paying a mortgage payment. Also, I'm going to have to pay double rent, because when you rent somewhere, you pay first month's rent plus a security deposit, which is the same. And we're also going to have to pay for the actual move itself. And I'm like, I don't know. We're going to have to take out a loan. I'm going to sell a kidney. We're going to have to figure something out, because I don't know how we're going to get there. And then this amazing thing happened. So at the church that I was at, part of the compensation package that we originally agreed to was they were supposed to put back a certain amount of money each month into a retirement plan for me. And then, I would just have that money. And so I'm about to leave the church, and I go to the pastor, and I was like, hey, can I get that account information so I can transfer it over to Austin Baptist and start putting my own money into it? And he goes, Nathan, I got some bad news. We never filled out the paperwork. So we have not been putting any of this money aside. And I was like, cool, great, thank you. But this amazing thing happened, is he said, you know what I'm going to do? You've been here for 16 months. I'm just going to write you a check for that amount per month times 16. And suddenly I get this lump sum of cash that I had $150 left for what it cost me for the move. I mean, seriously, I had a little bit of a surplus for what it cost me to move. And we had the renters come in, so we had to worry about double mortgage payment. We were worried about Ellie and what is she going to do for a job? How is she going to find a clinic? Well, when we first considered this, she posted on a Christian veterinarian group asking people, hey, we're thinking about moving to Austin. Does anyone know of any clinics who are potentially looking for something? And within like one day, she had like 4 clinics reach out and be like, please come here. Like, we need you, please. And so she came to Austin and she had 5 interviews and she got 4 job offers. And immediately was able to find a clinic that was a better situation and just so good for her. I could go on, but you get the point. That when we are faithful with what God has called us to do, he finds a way and he provides for us. When we don't do what God has called us to do, we miss out on those blessings. God's plan continues, right? God did not need me to come to Austin Baptist Church for Austin Baptist Church to flourish and be a great church. He didn't. Somebody else could have come in and done it, and God's plan still would have gone. But if I hadn't have listened, then I would have missed out on the blessing that this church has been. Because Ellie and I came here, and we're not going anywhere. We love it. Really, we do. This is the happiest we have been in a place since we have been married. We love the church. We love the people. We love the community that we have. And overall, just an amazing place to be. And then professionally for me, once again, I am excited and passionate, and I have been restored in my call, and I come to work excited every day about the opportunity to increase God's kingdom and to help students come to know the Lord. And I am pumped to be here on a staff of people who not only are all extremely talented and we all work together, but we actually all like each other, right? And we're able to have community and fellowship and spend time together. And since I've been at this church, I don't know if y'all have realized this. So I got here in the middle of September, and I'm not saying this in an arrogant way like I'm the cause of this, because that's not the case. But since I have been here in September, it seems like every single weekend we have at least one family join the church. And how amazing is that? That in the midst of a pandemic, when there's still churches in Austin who aren't even opening their doors yet, that our church is growing, that our church is thriving, that we are having multiple families join the church a month, and it feels like we're having a baptism once a month. I mean, this is awesome and exciting. And all of this, I believe, truly believe, would have still happened even if I wasn't here, but I would have missed it. And so, as we close, here's my hope and my prayer for you. That today would be a defining moment in your life. That today would be the day whenever you acknowledge what God asks you to do and you say, you know what, I might be scared of what it's going to cost me, but God's worth it. And just be reminded of that simple reminder that Jesus gave to Peter. Don't worry about all of this. You follow me. Let's pray.